Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. With me today to share the 10 spiritual books that inspired him on his life journey is poet, storyteller, wisdom keeper, scientist, researcher, and licensed clinical psychologist, Father Sean Alera. Got to get it right, these Irish names. So, and I'll also tell you that he is an ordained Catholic priest who writes books with deliciously provocative titles like What is Truth?, Spirits in Spacesuits, Souls on Safari, and Setting God Free, moving beyond the caricature we've created in our own image, which debunks many of the stories in the Old Testament. Father Sean Alera, welcome.
Thanks a million, Sandie. It's great to talk to you.
I loved your description of your response to the rule that you could only pick 10 books. Tell us what you said.
So it felt like I was like a kid in a candy store. Somebody brought me in, I'm surrounded by these delicacies all around. And then I told, but you can only pick one. I felt, what am I going to do with all the books I've loved over the 78 years of my life? So I figured out I have to have some kind of a scientific approach to this. So let me pick out 4 areas of interest to me. And I picked out mythology and scripture was one area. Psychology was another area, spirituality was another area, and the 4th area was science, because I'm trained in mathematics and mathematical physics. And so I picked out these 4 areas and then said, can I pick out books in each category? And then I picked out authors that I liked. And then I came down finally with a list of 10 different books. I think I had 3 in the kind of mythology, scripture, 1 in science, 3 in psychology, and 3 in spirituality. But I felt like it was like Sophie's choice. I can't believe you're telling me to kind of sacrifice all these other kids, and just pick out 10. So, but it was a great
exercise. It's a cool task, a very cool task. I know so many people. We don't even think about how much books mean to us until we face something like this, and then we really have to think about it. Right. So we're going to start with your first book on your list, which is Irish Sagas and Folk Tales by Eileen. And let me see if I can pronounce this right. O'Fearlin?
Freiloin?
Freiloin. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Published in 1954. Tell us about this book.
So it's interesting. I've always been fascinated by mythology because I had a grandfather who was basically a druid, and he was the greatest storyteller I've ever come across in my life. And having had the privilege of being raised bilingually, and then going to Africa and learning 4 African languages and the mythologies of those, I realized really quickly that mythology and folklore is the archived wisdom of a culture. If you really want to go to the wisdom of any culture, you have to learn their stories. And stories, they create origin myths for us. Every group needs to know where did they come from. And every child does. If you do genealogical research, you want to figure out who your great-great-great-great-grandparents were. So as individuals and as cultures, and as organizations of various kinds, we always want to know what our origin myths are. And every culture I've ever lived among, and every place I've studied, they're all origin myths that tell where we came from. And then they have to be able also to give us the courage to deal with present vicissitude. And the third thing they have to do is to prepare us for the future. So a great story should tell us where we came from, how we're going to deal with present issues, and then what kind of a glorious future we're trying to create for ourselves. And that's how I see the scriptures of all the great traditions. The Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Pitakas of Buddhism, the Quran, Irish folklore, African mythology, they're all doing the same thing. They're all the revealed word of God. They're the way in which God speaks to us. And there's something about stories particularly, that stories engage the imagination. So particularly when you're reading or you're listening to a great storyteller, what you're doing actually, the storyteller is giving you a surfboard, but you're going to have to surf the waves of your own imagination. You're going to have to create the scenes on the basis of just the words that the storyteller is using. So it's a very interactive process. And so the stories are not basically about information, they're about transformation. They're about, making your soul sing. And so that's how I regard the scriptures of great traditions, that they're great stories. Now the question is, how are you going to unpack the stories? So there's a great statement, for instance, of Jesus in the New Testament. It's in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13, where he's been harassed by his hearers. Why are you always talking in parables? Talk plainly to us. And he gives two different explanations. At one stage he says, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. So what's he saying? He's saying, if you're listening to me just with your intellect, you're not going to get it. You have to listen with your heart and with your soul. So I differentiate between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so he's saying, don't listen to me with your ears or with your brain. Listen to me with your heart and with your soul. And that's the purpose of stories, because stories are ever fresh. Every generation is going to unpack the same story depending on the circumstances in which they find themselves. So when I look at the scriptures of various kinds, or the mythologies of various peoples, I'm seeing the soul of the nation wrestling with the issues of their time. So that's the importance for me of folklore. And as I think I may have mentioned in the blurb I wrote, it was the only book I brought to Africa with me. In 1972, when I was hoping to spend the rest of my life in Kenya as a missionary priest, the only book I brought with me was Idino Freilon's book on Irish mythology.
Mm. Wow. Book number 2, The New American Bible, the Catholic edition by Moses, Matthew, Mark, et al.
Right. So the reason I included the Catholic version is that there's a difference between the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible. In the Catholic Bible, there are 73 books. In the Protestant version, there are only 66. So there were 7 books that got excluded during the Reformation. So I like to include those. Now, there's a lot of other books that got thrown out, a kind of epiphenomenal kinds of stuff, or kind of Gnostic scriptures that didn't even get included in the Catholic version. But if you're going to choose a version, you're going to get 7 more books in the Catholic version that you're going to get in the Protestant version. So that's the reason why I kind of cling out to that. And then when you translate from one language to another, there are 3 rules or 3 ways of translating any language into another language. The first one is literal translation, where you translate a verb with a verb, a noun with a noun, an adjective with an adjective. And that would appear to be the best way of doing it, but it's terrible, because you can't capture proverb, or you can't capture puns, or you can't capture humor when you translate literally. So the second way is called dynamic transference, where you try to understand the mindset of the original, and you try to understand the audience that the original was addressing, the economic circumstances, the political environment, and you try to kind of marinate in that culture, and then you translate coming out of that. So that's the second way of doing it. And the third way is you start with a predetermined agenda that you wanted to say, and then you translate it, and you brutalize it in order to conform to your own particular expectation. And you get that a lot with kind of fundamentalist Christian thinkers. So I pick out this particular one then because it's dynamic transference. It's kind of bathing in the culture out of which these books came, trying to understand the mindset, the financial situation, the political situation, the social dynamics, and try to kind of render in translation that honors all those. So that's why I would have picked out that particular one.
And you said in your description that you were greatly influenced by your great grandmother, who was a Catholic mystic who had conversations all the time with Mother Mary, and she actually taught you how to unpack the Bible stories in their esoteric meanings.
Absolutely. So she was alive. I've got a photograph of her right up here in front of me. I called her Muddy. I couldn't pronounce her name as a child, so I called her Muddy. And so she was alive until I was 10 years of age. So she was a major influence on my life. And she would talk aloud during the day to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so we have this term in Gaelic. It's called a chailoit, which means a thin place, a place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous. And there are places in Ireland, sacred spaces, and there are sacred times of the year, like Biocentrism on the 1st of May, or Samhain, the 1st of November, when the veil is particularly diaphanous and you can move through effortlessly. But she lived in that place, and she was constantly moving through the veil. And as a little child, I presume that was the norm. And in actual fact, all little children between the ages of 2 and 5 live there. They're constantly moving through the veil. And then we pat them on the head and talk about their imaginary friends. They're not imaginary in the sense that they're phantasms. It's rather they're moving through the veil continually, and they're having dialogues and encounters with entities and energies that reside at the other side of the veil. So hanging around Muddy for the first 10 years of my life, I presumed, that was the norm, that you got to dialogue with the denizens of the other side, particularly the kind of the mystical characters like Mother Mary. And so when she told me the Bible stories, then that was the unpacking, that was the hermeneutics that she used, the interpretative model that she used to look at all the stories that she found in the scriptures. So it wasn't a literalist interpretation. It was bathing in the imagination, surfing the web of the mystical understandings of these texts.
Yeah. Book number 3, Escaping Eden by Paul Wallis, published in 2020. An author and a book that I think certainly my audience is very familiar with. What attracted you to this material?
I was actually introduced to Paul by Regina Meredith. And Paul and I actually did 4 joint interviews with Regina through Gaia. So that's how I got to know him. And so I've read 3 of his 4 books at this stage. I love his stuff, and we've corresponded a little bit. So the last book I wrote, the one that says Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image, I actually had a chapter in that book originally that was edited out, where I looked at the possibility that the gods described in the Hebrew scriptures are actually extraterrestrial entities that had particular kind of parts of planet Earth. And it got edited out because the editor told me, originally she put it into an appendix at the back of the book, and then she said the book is still too long. We need to excise this piece. But in that particular piece, I had looked at the notion of cargo cults, the belief system that when a very sophisticated culture meets a very primitive culture, the primitives act as if the others were actually God figures. And very often they come from the skies in aircraft of various kinds. And so my belief system was that actually, I think there are 3 kinds of gods that we find. The first kind are what I call regional divinities, that there are particular gods who own particular parts of the real estate of planet Earth. And if you move into that location, you have to pay obedience to those. And the Romans were very, very careful about that. When the Roman Empire conquered a new terrain, they were very, very careful to honor the local gods of the area into which they'd gone. They didn't want to upset those local gods. So they insisted that, they will kind of pay obedience to whatever gods of the region they've conquered. So the first kind of gods I call regional divinities. The second I call kind of tribal divinities. So these were gods who attached themselves to particular peoples. And if these were nomadic tribes, they followed them around, and the people kept to that particular god. That was a second kind of divinity. And the third one I call portfolio divinities, that there were gods who had a particular interest or expertise. So if you want to kind of, you're interested in art, here are the guy you need to follow. You're interested in agriculture, that's the guy you need to look at. You're interested in war making, here's the guy you need to kind of. So for me, there are 3 kinds of divinities, but they're all kinds of sky beings. And I believe very, very strongly that most of the kind of religions initially got founded on kind of obedience to sky creatures of various kinds. So that's what Paul and I have in common very, very much. Now, Paul is a brilliant expert at hermeneutics, the art and the science of, interpretation. How do you take, ancient texts and unpack them? so as to capture the original meanings intended by the authors or the circumstances out of which this genre of literature emerged. So he and I have a lot in common. I would consider Paul a much greater expert in hermeneutics than I. And so we have a lot in common, but I defer very much to him and his hermeneutical skills.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite an eye-opening book. And every one that follows it is even better.
Yes.
Wait till you get to book number 5. I really enjoyed that one.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So book number 4, Biocentrism, How Life and Consciousness Are the Keys to Understanding the True Nature of the Universe, written by Robert Lanza, one of the most respected scientists in the world, in 2009.
Right. So, as I told you, in my undergraduate major, I had a double major, which was a pure mathematics and mathematical physics at the National University of Ireland. And I was always fascinated at the interface between science, psychology, and spirituality. But I understood immediately that, the scientific method is very interesting, because the scientific method is not just true of science itself. It's true of any kind of search for truth. So when I look at the scientific method, essentially, there are 10 steps to the scientific method. The first one is that a scientist has a particular area of interest. And so the first thing is she makes observations in her area of interest. That's step 1 always. Step 2 is she begins to gather data as a result of her observations. Step 2. Step 3, she's looking for some possible putative patterns in her data. Is there some kind of a pattern lurking in the data here? Stage 3. Stage 4 is if she determines, yeah, I can see a pattern here. Has she got a hypothesis that might explain this pattern? Stage 4. Stage 5 is she's going to have to set up an experiment to test her hypothesis to see if it's actually true. If it turns out to be correct, she needs to have it replicated in somebody else's laboratory, because it could just be a statistical aberration. Because statistics, all scientific research is based on probability theory. So it could just be a coincidence. So stage 6 is it must be replicated in 1 or 2 more laboratories. Now, if you get the same result, now you've established a principle in the field. That's stage 7. Now you do put a bunch of principles together, and you've established a model of the field, whether it's physics or geology or science or psychology, whatever. Now you have a model of the field. But at some stage, new anomalous data are going to present themselves. And now you're kind of squeezing these into the old model, and it's groaning at the seams. And at some stage, so many anomalous new data arrive that you have to abandon the old model and create a brand new model that can accommodate all the old data and all the new anomalous data. Science does that regularly. So we did it twice in the 20th century. We did it with relativity theory in 1915 and with quantum mechanics in 1920. Now that model is true in spirituality as well. You look at all the great mystics, they go through exactly the same stages. It's an area of interest, like spending time in the desert or meditation or mantras or whatever it is. So there's, the observations. They collect their data. They observe patterns in their data. They can check notes with others. Do you have the same when you meditate? What happens to you? So now you establish a principle and then a model. And then subsequently there are kind of new mystical experiences. How can you cram them into the old model? And now you have religions groaning under the weight of anomalous data that they can no longer accommodate. So you've got to break down the old models and realize that religion is the training wheel for spirituality. And so again and again and again, I see in science that this needs to happen. And when I studied science, I realized that all of science is actually based on faith. We think that science is the one area where you don't need faith. It is totally based on faith. Mathematics is the queen of all the sciences, but pure mathematics is based on what are called the 5 Peano postulates. There was a great Italian mathematician called Giuseppe Peano, who created the 5 postulates of numbers, with which you can't do set theory. Now, so you have to have postulates that you can't prove. At the beginning of the 20th century, science began to believe, now we will create a system that's not dependent upon any article of faith. And in 1931, a brilliant Austrian mathematician called Kurt Gödel came up with what's called the incompleteness theorem, which showed that no axiomatic system of either numbers or philosophical statements can be both complete and consistent. It can be complete but not consistent, or it can be consistent but it can't be complete. In other words, there must be at least one article of faith that you can build your model on, without which you can't do it. 2,500 years before that, Euclid had the same problem. He came up with his 5 postulates for Euclidean geometry, and most of them are self-evident, but they can never be proven. So one of them was the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. That's self-evident, but it cannot be proven. In 2,300 years, no mathematician has ever been able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's actually true. So you have to take it on faith, and then you build Euclidean geometry on that. So now we have the scientific model. They're asking us to make an article of faith that before there was time and before there was space and before there was matter, there was a big bang out of which everything came. So it's like, give us this great miracle for which there is no proof whatsoever. Take that as a postulate, and then we build all of science on top of that. It's a bigger miracle than the resurrection of Jesus or the virgin birth. And it's an article of faith, and it's not holding up anymore. We know from the Webb telescope right now that there are galaxies being discovered that totally upset this notion of the Big Bang. And so when I look at the scientific model then, and looking at Robert Lanza's work, it's the realization there's something that predates the scientific method, and it is pure consciousness. And so it's that the essence of the universe is consciousness, or awareness. And everything then follows from that. And the brain is just a transducer of consciousness. So everything that exists is a kind of a reducer or a redactor of consciousness, or a kind of a... so when I think, for instance, that every cell in the body is a kind of a redactor of cosmic consciousness. It tells the cells how to be cells. Every organ in my body is a kind of reducing cosmic consciousness and telling my heart how to behave like a heart. It's not telling my heart how to behave as a kidney. So there's a special consciousness that reduces cosmic consciousness to hearts, another one to kidneys, another one to eyeballs. The same thing is true for a species. There's a specific kind of a redactor or a reducer, that creates a species. When you look, for instance, at, have you ever seen a swarm of birds flying in unison? And totally in unison. It's like the entire group of birds is taken over by some kind of a unified consciousness temporarily. Now, I think that for all the ways from cells to organs to organisms to a species to global populations to Milky Way galaxies, everything is just a specific kind of a reducer that takes cosmic consciousness and makes it appropriate for whatever it's trying to create, whether it's a star, a galaxy, a heart, a lung, or a kidney. And so they're very, very specific. And so what I like about Lanza's book is that he gives the terminology and the understanding why only consciousness can explain the phenomena that science is interested in.
I love that. Book number 5. This was an interesting one. Night,
Yes.
by the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the political activist and writer and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel.
Yeah.
When I went looking for this book,
Yeah.
I found so many versions of it that it said, Night, Elie Wiesel, author unknown.
Right.
Only one turned up. This one was published in 1973, and it was the only one that actually said Elie Wiesel was the author of this book. So
that's fascinating, because when he, as the book says, he was a young boy, in Europe when the Nazis moved in, a young Jewish boy whose family got wiped out, literally all burnt to death upstairs in a church. They packed him into a church and burned the church around him. His mother threw him out through the window, and he escaped. But he got captured, and he went through Auschwitz, but survived it. And he brought this text of his memories to actually a very, very famous French Catholic author at the time, in the 1950s, 1960s. And this Catholic author took him under his wing and had it published. And it's the story of how do you survive when your family is destroyed, when your culture is destroyed, when your religion is destroyed, when you're on a death march and you're watching people literally being thrown into the ovens, and you somehow survive. What do you do with God at that stage? How do you continue to believe in a God, as he did, while getting angry and shaking your fist at God? So God is either uninterested or powerless, or why does God allow this kind of stuff to happen? So it's an extraordinary kind of an examination of the oldest problem in theology is called theodicy, the theodicy problem. The problem is, why do bad things happen to good people? Or what is the origin of evil? So I mean that's a whole discussion on its own. But he's wrestling with this notion then of a God who seems either disinterested or powerless, and he's shaking his fist at God, and at the same time never losing faith in God. So what kind of faith do you have, or what kind of trust do you have in a being that seems to leave you to your own devices? Or how do you explain, the extraordinary kind of the genocide that he witnessed in his time? So it was an extraordinary kind of memoir of somebody who somehow survived and kept a belief in the divine.
So what was his conclusion? I mean, how did he keep his belief? He must have found peace in there somewhere.
That somehow, that it is the ability to wrestle with vicissitude that kind of creates the beauty of the human soul. Now, this is something I spent a lot of time working on, Sandie, the problem of evil. And I really believe, I may have said to you in a previous kind of conversation that I seed my dreams at night. Before I go to sleep at night, I'll have a question I want an answer to, and I go to sleep with that in my mind. And then I'll watch my dreams and say, what answer are my dreams giving, or my higher self, or cosmic consciousness? So about 2 years ago, I went to sleep with this question. I want to know the difference between sin and evil. And I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the answer I got was, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. Sin is just breaking a human law, whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And I really believe that there are beings out there, perhaps the same kind of beings that kind of colonized Earth and created religions, to kind of divert us from the real divine. And so that in some senses, there's an agenda to separate souls from source. And we've been wrestling with this issue throughout all of human history, and you can do it in various ways. And one of the most devious ways is to try to do it through religion, to pretend that you're going to give people a system of contacting God, where in fact you're just reducing it to fundamentalist dogmatic decrees and obedience to some kind of a hierarchical oligarchy. And so evil, I think, is primarily the result of energy, beings who are actually feeding on the energy of warfare and pain and anxiety and depression. Much like, for instance, when I look at people, bullfighting, that you're going to torture an animal to death, for the delectation of 20,000 people in an arena. Are you going to make dogs fight and kill each other and cheer them on? So there's something about the human spirit that we're actually feeding energetically on the distress of other beings, and that's true at a global level. That the part of the reason for warfare and disputes between nations and cultures is that a higher level of consciousness is feeding off of this. Now, I think there are beings who are much more benign and loving of us, angelic beings, who are trying to wake us up to the reality. So there's this titanic struggle going on. When we agree to incarnate, we agree to the fact we're going to find ourselves in these dense three-dimensional spacesuits in which kind of it is difficult to discern, evil from good, to discern darkness from light. And that's the purpose of incarnation. Can we fight the good fight, even as we're subjected to the limitations of a very tiny little brain, the illusion of time, and being operating in these tiny little spacesuits we call our bodies? And so it's a fascinating topic. And so he's wrestling with that. He's coming up with his own answer. I think I've had more time than he did. I maybe had more experience or exposure to different traditions and cultures. And I've come up with what I consider a very, very kind of a sophisticated model of the problem of evil. But that would take us 6-7 hours of a discussion to get into that piece.
More shows. Yeah. I'm not averse. Okay, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview, and sharing his 10 best list of most inspirational books today is poet, storyteller, scientist, wisdom keeper, and clinical psychologist, Shauna Lehrer, whose own riveting books, which include Spirits in Spacesuits, Souls on Safari, and Setting God Free, may well have been a contribution to his being disowned by the Roman Catholic Church. We'll be back with more. Father Shauna Lehrer has a fantastic story, so do stay tuned. We'll hear more about his books and his own journey.
Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting Times Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit Sedgbeer.com. Click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's Sedgbeer.com, SEDGBEER.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these three levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those three levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Father Sean Alera, book number 6, Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life, by Jill Bolt Taylor.
Right, Jill, an extraordinary woman. She was a scientist, a top scientist who had a left brain stroke many years ago that knocked out her left hemisphere completely. So she had to relearn how to walk and to talk. So she was being just basically looked after by her own mother for 8 years. So she wrote a book at that stage called My Stroke of Insight, because she was reduced to working from her right hemisphere, the creative part. Then she wrote this follow-on book, Whole Brain Living, in which she talks about 4 facets of the brain. So in the front left-hand side, you have rational thinking, which is very important for planning and creating schedules and stuff like that. The second behind is the emotional left brain, where we're constantly comparing present situations with past trauma. It's constantly looking out for dangerous situations. So it's living in a very, very anxious life. And then number 3 is the emotional right brain. And that is the ability to really surf the present moment, not to be constantly comparing this with previous situations, but to be totally present to the now. And the front right then is kind of unit of consciousness, where we're part of a totality, not just of our own particular journey. And so learning how to make these four parts talk to each other becomes really, really important. The realization that they all have a function to play in the human journey, but that for the vast bulk of particularly Western peoples that were living in the left-hand side particularly, that our thinking is dominated by our emotional reactions based on fear, and prejudice of various kinds. And so even as we plan the future, it's based on all the dark stuff that we've experienced, or the interpretations of stuff that we've experienced, without any kind of access to the ability to live, to be in the present moment, and particularly to be in unit of consciousness. So when I read her book, I think of step as like, there's a famous homily that the Buddha gave one time. He's walking along the road with a bunch of his disciples, and he picks a flower and he holds it aloft. And they're waiting for him. Okay, what are you going to say about the flower? And he's just holding it up. And a minute passes. He said nothing. 2 minutes pass. 3 minutes. Like, dude, what's the story? And then suddenly one of the disciples breaks into a huge smile. And the Buddha says, yes, you got it. And so what he's saying is, if you really saw a flower, you see God. And Christ will say the very same thing 550 years later. Look at the lilies of the field. They don't spin or weave or gather into barns. And yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his fine regal robes looked as good as one of these. Why are you afraid? And so this ability to be totally present to the miracle of the moment, we've lost that. And this is what Jill Bolte Taylor is coming back up again, that every moment is pregnant with the love of God. If we only have the eyes to see, there is no place where God is not present. There's no situation in which we can't harvest it for a divine kind of a gift. And then the front is to join that to the unit of consciousness, that this is the birthright of everything that exists. Every bunny rabbit, every oak tree, every human being is part of that extraordinary unit of consciousness. So she writes this beautiful book as a scientist, telling how you can actually activate the physical brain to participate in that process, rather than to kind of back us into this fear-based thinking about the future.
I love her work. I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
Book number 7, Beyond the Brain, Birth, Death and Transcendence in Psychotherapy. And that's by Stanislav Grof, published in 1985.
Right. So I read that book in 1987. So having spent 14 years in Africa and a year in England, I came to the States in 1987 to pursue PhD in psychology. And I came across that book for the first time ever. And I then did a perinatal workshop based on this material. And in fact, it was then I had my first personal reincarnational experience. So there was a workshop where, you got to experience your own birthing process. So they created a birth canal of pillows and created a special kind of music, and the lights are down and you have a sitter, make sure you don't get into any kind of problems. And there's a group of 24 of us doing this workshop. So in the morning, I'm the sitter for somebody, and in the afternoon, I'm having the experience and somebody else is sitting for me. So everybody else had the experience of their own birthing process. When it came to me, I had the experience of being a young Tibetan girl giving birth to her own firstborn child. That was my first reincarnation experience. And it was so real, I literally had pains in my thighs for a week afterwards. And so I got fascinated then with Stan Grof's work. And this notion of the perinatal matrices, that he believes that the 4 stages of pregnancy and birthing are correlated with subsequent kind of neurotic behavior of adults. Depending on where the difficulties lay, in the birthing process, there'll be corresponding kinds of neurotic behavior in the adult. And he broke it into 4 kind of sections. So the first one is the womb experience itself. Is it a happy environment or a toxic environment for the child? And so is the mother being well nurtured, and is she being surrounded by love? Or is she being subjected to domestic abuse, or is she on crack cocaine? So what is the first stage is, what's the actual in utero experience of the little baby? Is it good or is it toxic? Stage number 2 is the birthing process begins. The contractions are happening, the walls are closing in, the roof is coming down, the floor is coming up, but the cervix is still closed. So there's no way out. So the child is trapped. And this kind of total fear, claustrophobia, that everything is changing suddenly. The third stage is the cervix is now open and the birthing process begins. So now you're spelunking down the tunnel, the birth canal, but there's no guarantee you're going to survive the journey. And the fourth stage, then you're out and the umbilical cord is cut and there's bright lights and loud noises and whatever. Now, I think that's really true for every one of us, and I've used this in my psychology practice. But in the last year, I've come to the conclusion that the basic perinatal matrices are true not just for the individual human being, but for individual cultures and even for the global culture itself. And so I ask myself the question right now, is the United States of America right now, is it a welcoming womb or is it a toxic womb for its denizens? What's the experience like for Americans right now, or for people in the UK in their culture, or people in Denmark in their culture? What's the womb like, the cultural womb like where you are right now? Stage number 2 then. Now, when the contractions begin, but the cultural cervix is still closed, and everything's closing around you, how are you experiencing that? And how are you going to deal with it? Are you going to panic? Are you going to freak out? Stage number 3, the cultural cervix is now open and the birthing process is beginning, but am I going to make it safely? These times we're in, is it going to lead to a World War III, or is it going to lead to a shift in human consciousness? And then finally is the birthing process. So who are the doulas and the midwives and the doctors who are facilitating this birthing process? Are they really interested in birthing a bouncing baby? Are they trying to create a kind of a late-term abortion because they want to stay in control of Project Planet Earth? So for me, I now apply the basic perinatal matrices to the global evolutionary trajectory, and to kind of pray that we're going to create a really healthy baby in the future. That planet Earth is going to look significantly different, in 10 years' time than it did, 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, one of your books, one of the authors of your books, has an answer to that. We'll get to that one in a minute. Book number 8, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of Near-Death Experience, by the Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, published in 2007.
Right. The thing I like about it, I've seen many kind of podcasts or interviews that have been done with him. But what I like about him particularly is he's a modern polymath. He's got this extraordinary ability and knowledge of so many different fields, like cardiology, obviously, but quantum mechanics, traditional science, biology. He's a real expert in many of these fields, in the consciousness research stuff. And so what I love about him is that he's able to frame the study of near-death experiences in a scientific language, and demolish the pathetic efforts by the naysayers to claim that it's just anoxia or kind of lack of oxygen in the dying brain, or whatever. That he's dismantling all of the ridiculous obstacles that will be thrown in his path, and representing this in extraordinarily deep quantum mechanical language that makes eminent sense to me. But that he's straddling these areas of expertise and is cross-fertilizing them to their mutual benefit. So I've loved reading that book.
Book number 9 is a book that I personally loved, and have been, telling everybody I meet about it. LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven, Christopher Bache, published in 2019. And he certainly has an answer to your question. Yes. What are we birthing?
Absolutely. It was fascinating to me because I've never done LSD. I'm fascinated at psychonautical research, but I have never done LSD. I never even smoked weed. So I kind of generate my altered states of consciousness through different kinds of practices. But I'm fascinated by anybody who has the cojones to do what he did. 73 trips, graphic encounters with kind of global darkness. And that he had the courage with his wife. His wife was a psychologist, and that she could guide him through these experiences over a period of nearly 20 years. And that he could stick with the regimen in which he was kind of experiencing firsthand these extraordinary, not just personal traumas and personal darkness, but not even global darkness, but cosmic darkness. And that he had the courage to somehow tough it out and keep going through it and saying, what can he harvest from his experiences? And it was fascinating to me that at the very end of the book, in answer to an interview he was doing, he listed 12 different beliefs that came to him as a result of his experiences. And every single one of them I could check off and say, yes, I'm 100% in agreement with you. Yes, that's been my experience. That's my belief system as well. So it's like a checklist of my personal cosmology. And I'm very, very big that every individual person needs to create their own personal cosmology. And a personal cosmology should do 4 things for you. It should make your heart sing because it's in alignment with your soul's purpose. Secondly, it should stretch you out of your comfort zone because you constantly need to grow. Thirdly, it should have an explanation for every single experience you have. Whether it's do you believe in extraterrestrials? Do you believe, whatever, can I explain that? Yes or no? And fourthly, it needs to be constantly updated. And he did that, session by session by session, dealing through these 4 pieces. And so what I love about him is that on the basis of that, he created this extraordinary personal cosmology, which was literally cosmic in its import. And I think that's our function here. That we're not just human beings, members of a particular family or of a particular culture or even a particular species, let alone of a particular galactic federation, that we are cosmic entities. And that I had a vision several years ago where I saw God self-fracturing into holographic fractals of source. And a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So God self-fractures into these, what Hebrew will call netzwotzim, sparks of the divine. And then he called the first conference and said, let's co-create something together. And all of these billions of souls, of which you and I are members, co-created a cosmos. And then the second stage was, could we participate within the cosmos itself? Could we take on avatars or spacesuits that would allow us to experience from the inside out what it's like to be actually a part of that cosmic scenario? And very, very brave souls took on the toughest task, which is a 3-dimensional spacesuit, like these things you and I are wearing right now, which are so sunk in the density of separation from the source that most of us don't even realize that there is a God, that we are God, that nothing exists except God. Now, I think Chris Bash got that in spades. He really plumbed that, and he did it in extraordinary detail. I loved the way he presented it.
Yes. I've spoken to Chris many times, and I'm just, in awe, and I don't use that word lightly.
Yes.
Yeah. So number 10 is Seeking Jordan, How I Learned the Truth About Death and the Invisible Universe by Matthew McKay, published in 2016.
Right, yeah. And so I've known Matt for probably 30 years now. In fact, we co-wrote a book together in 2013. Himself and Ralph Metzner and I, we wrote a book called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. But I'd known Matt long before that. And I knew him when his son Jordan was murdered in San Francisco. This young man coming back from his girlfriend's house, cycling in San Francisco. He'd just gotten off, a train, and he was cycling home, and he was killed by some convict. Nobody was ever found for it. Probably a kind of an initiation rite, that there are gangs, and in order to be initiated, you have to commit a murder, and you just pick out a random individual and kill them. You have to prove, that you're capable of killing, and then the gang people can hold that over your head. They have information then that they could give to the cops at any stage. So obviously, he was killed in this random shooting. So you can imagine a father getting a phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning that his son had been murdered, early in the evening. So Matt is devastated, as you can well imagine. And he's on this extraordinary search, is this the end? Does consciousness end with a murder? And so he sought out a few psychics, and Ralph Metzner particularly. Ralph was an extraordinary individual himself and a great hypnotherapist. So Matt McKay went through a whole bunch of almost like seances where he contacted his son Jordan. And they had this ongoing extraordinary conversation where Matt would ask the questions and Jordan would give the answers. And Matt has now created, together they've written 3 books, and he's about to finish a 4th book. And once again, it's the kind of the answer to the really deep, important cosmological questions. And Jordan was probably, I'm going to say maybe 22, 23 when this happened, and the knowledge that he's giving from the other side is way in excess of anything he ever studied on this side. So he's not drawing this information, from this side. Nor is Matt. Matt is a brilliant psychologist himself, and has written about 40 books which are used as texts in colleges on psychology. But there are areas he covers, like scientific areas, that Matt has no interest in or knowledge of whatsoever, nor did Jordan when he was still incarnated. but Jordan is delivering this information on a regular basis to Matt. So Matt will just ask a question, then take up a pen and start automatic writing. And there's 3 brilliant books that have come out of it as a result. That was the first one, Seeking Jordan. Jordan was his son's name.
So that is your 10 best books. If you had to pick one that shifted you, moved you, transformed you in some way, which one would it be?
It would be Chris Bash's book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell him that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of all of these authors, some of whom you know, those that you don't know and have never met, who would you most want to have dinner with?
Well, obviously, I'd like to meet with Chris Bash for that kind of conversation. If she were alive, I doubt she is now, Eileen O'Freilein. This book was published way back in 1954. And she was actually the daughter of a very famous Irish writer called Sean O'Freilein. So given my kind of fascination with mythology, and with spending time in Ireland, we call them Shanachis. A Shanachi is a storyteller. And when I was growing up in Ireland as a little child, every village had its Shanachi. And my grandfather was the local Shanachi where I grew up. And so I was privy, I got these stories from, the time I was a little child. So I'd love to meet either Eileen O'Freilein or one of the great kind of mythology collectors. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was a whole bunch of people went to kind of collect these stories. And when I was in the seminary, I actually had a meeting with a man called Seamus Ó de Lairga. And Seamus Ó de Lairga had founded the Irish Folklore Commission way back in 1922. And he was using the school children of Ireland to go out to their grandparents to collect stories and bring them into the school. And the school teachers would write them down. And when the phonograph was invented, he sent people around the country with phonographs recording the voices of these storytellers. And then he created the greatest kind of collection of folklore anywhere in the world is in Trinity College in Dublin. There's Irish folklore is the biggest kind of encyclopedic collection of folklore of any culture in the world. So I actually had the privilege of meeting Seamus Ó de Lairga way back about 1968. So I would love to meet one of those kind of collectors of Irish folklore, people who had kind of hands-on connections with all of these old men and the old women all over the country who told these stories in their own accents, just to be able to kind of pick their brains. Yeah, that'd be my wish.
You've led a fascinating life, and you've been disowned by the Roman Catholic Church, for probably attracting more customers than the fellow bishops and priests down the road. You co-founded, and you're the spiritual director of a non-denominational community called Companions on the Journey, which is based in Palo Alto. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And so I think I may have said to you before that after 14 years living in Kenya, I was thrown out by the government because I was clashing with politicians over corruption in the government. And so I was thrown out of Kenya in 1986. I spent a year actually in London, in Mill Hill, living in Mill Hill. And I was studying hypnotherapy and Jungian psychology, and then came to the States. And then I was part of the Catholic Diocese of San Jose, and for about 8 years. So I got my board and keep for, working as a priest, doing baptisms, marriages, saying mass, stuff like that. But I was constantly kind of talking about reincarnation and about having women priests in the Catholic Church. It didn't make any sense to me. I would tell I would make up stories like, imagine a situation where it's after Jesus has descended back into heaven and the Catholic Church has been founded and Peter is the first pope. And it's a Sunday morning, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, gets on her cell phone and calls Mary of Magdala, and she says, Mary, can you tell me where St. Peter saying Mass? Where's St. Peter saying Mass today? And Mary gives her a text message and says, it's in such and such a place. And they go to it, and Peter is saying Mass with his back to the crowd, and it comes to Holy Communion, and the two Marys kneel down, and he comes up with the host, he says, the body of Christ, the body of Christ. And Mary, the woman who gave us the body of Christ, who conceived him, who carried him, who gave birth to him, and who nursed him at his own breath, she's not allowed to be a priest, but Peter, the guy who betrayed Jesus, is going to give Mary the body of Christ, but she can't be a priest. So I kind of make up stories like this. So I got in big trouble, and so at the end of that, I got thrown out of the diocese. And then on the 4th October 2010, I got a letter, a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican, telling me that I was being dismissed because of I'd broken two parts of canon law. That said I had lost my faith and I was disobedient, and so I was out. So at that stage, then we founded a group of community where the only necessary ingredient for inclusion was that you're prepared to work in your own cosmology. We're not going to tell you stuff you have to believe. You're not going to have to sign off on a creedal formulation. You have to be committed to understanding why you volunteered for life on planet Earth and what the hell are you doing about it right now. So that was the only kind of a criterion for admission. Are you interested seriously in your own spiritual journey, and are you prepared to put the hard work into figuring out, why you're here and what you're about to do? So it's been going on for 27 years.
Wow. So we are nearing our normal end, but I'm going to break the rules and I'm going to go a bit longer because I love talking to you. And there's a couple of things I want to ask you. And anyone who's listening to this on the radio, well, you're going to miss the ending, but you will get that ending if you go and watch the video on YouTube. So you've been thrown out of a lot of places. What are you planning to be thrown out of next?
Hopefully, I celebrated my 78th birthday 2 days ago. So at some stage, I'm going to get kicked out of this incarnation. I don't know what it's going to be in 10 years' time or 100 years' time or whatever. I have no idea what it's going to be. But I'm going to be kicked out of here as well. But it's not going to be kicked out because I know when I've done what I've come to do. And then I hope I'll graciously kind of exit. I'll shuffle off this mortal coil. It's like taking off this spacesuit and saying, okay, I use this to the best of my ability. The knees aren't working anymore. I got bunions at this stage. So I'm going to let go of this one and see what's next. And I actually did this March just passed. I do a retreat every year for my community, a 3-day retreat. And as the theme for it, I took an experience that I had actually with Matt McKay, who wrote Seeking Jordan. Matt did a hypnotic regression on me, a 4-hour session using the work of Michael Newton, where I wanted to experience what was the bardo state like between my last lifetime and my life as Sean. And it was one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of my life. What happened when I died in the last lifetime? And this is really tearful for me. I was a young Russian soldier in 1944, liberating a concentration camp of women and children. And coming up to the barbed wire and seeing this beautiful young red-headed woman inside the barbed wire, and somehow knowing she was a soulmate of mine, and trying to go in to kind of reach through the barbed wire to make contact, and being shot and killed. And that was my last memory of this, shocked look on the face of this woman. And realizing that we had sought each other over many lifetimes and had been separated from each other. And then trying to figure out why in God's name would that happen on a regular basis. And the message I got was that until you need God more badly than you need connection with this woman, you're going to keep missing each other. Wow. And that's the thing that I got this time.
Wow. Yes. So, would you choose to come back again?
Yes, I would, because I think that.
Go on.
I think that there's this notion in Buddhism called the Bodhisattva vow. That there are beings who have worked off all their own personal karma, but they're coming back to kind of wake up the rest of us. And as long as there are sleeping people on the planet, who are indulging in warfare and who don't know why the hell they're here, I think anybody with a compassionate heart is not going to be just watch that from the sideline and say, well, tough luck, I've done my piece, now it's up to them. I'd have to come back. Anybody with a heart would have to come back.
Would you come back as a priest again?
I've been a priest many times. At this stage now, I've recovered maybe 11 different lifetimes, just snippets from each of them. And in many of them, I was a priest or a monk or a druid, various kinds. And it was always the same kind of issue I was contending with the kind of the fundamentalist, dogmatic aspects of the religious systems of which I found myself a part. I'm bashing heads and trying to be some kind of a voice for spirituality in a sea of religious fundamentalism. And obviously that's still part of the situation, that a lot of world religions are still steeped in fundamentalist, dogmatic kind of thinking. And so the need for some figures within the systems to try to shake it up, shake it loose from the inside. And so it feels like there's a lot of that work still to be done. And I'm stupid enough to say, okay, send me.
Do you think that the Catholic Church will survive?
I don't think it deserves to. I don't think the future of religion is these huge, big monolithic organizations. I think it's kind of local faith communities, which are kind of like neurons on a global brain, that we're connecting with each other, inspiring each other, trading. And that's exactly how the young Christian churches started. It was hundreds of different local communities exchanging letters with each other until 325, when the Emperor Constantine wanted to lick them into shape, because he wanted a strong bulwark on the western side of his empire as he moved the empire to Constantinople. And so, what we need is a spirituality based on discrete communities, searching on their own, but connecting with each other, inspiring each other. So these big monolithic religions, Islam is gone, Christianity is gone. All of these megalithic systems with hierarchical kind of a structure to it, they've long outlived their usefulness. They don't deserve to survive, and they won't survive.
Well, going back to Chris Bache's book, I mean, certainly the future that he's seen, that they don't exist.
Yes.
You and I are of an age where we probably won't see the fall in our lifetime. But do you think that maybe, say, my children's lifetime or my grandchildren's, that would happen?
I was out for breakfast, my birthday 2 days ago, and my soulmate, Arlen, who lives about half a mile away from me, she took me into a little restaurant called The Parish for breakfast. And at the table across from us was a young couple with a baby that looked like it was about 8 months old. And every time I interact with a baby, if I get a chance, I'll always try to cuddle a child. And I'll always ask the child, not the parents, but the child. I'll ask them 2 questions. What is your name? And what is your purpose? And so the name is not the baptismal name. That the last thing that happens before we leave heaven is that grandmother God sings your secret, sacred name to you. And that's the name of your soul. And when you know what your soul's song is, and you sing it to yourself, you'll always stay on purpose. But they're the 2 questions I ever ask every single child. And I'm looking at this little child, maybe 6, 7 months old, and I'm saying, I'm just my birthday. When you're my age, what kind of a world will you be living in? And my prayer, obviously, that will be a very different world from the world I'm in at age 78. So I ask this of every single child I come across. What's your name? And what is your mission?
Do they all know?
They all know. The child knows. The parents don't, and the child is going to be educated by the parents and by the school system. You're supposed to be a ballerina, or a musician, or an engineer, or an accountant, or whatever. But by age 5, we've kind of beaten the wisdom out of them and inculcated them with, kind of factoids.
How can we remember?
One of the most important ways is spending time with little children. So I advocate that children between the age of 2 and 5 are constantly moving through the veil, because I've differentiated. There's a huge difference between imagination and fantasy. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter into different domains, and energies, encounter different beings that reside in those places, dialogue with them, learn from them, and bring that back here. And kids are doing that constantly. So to really watch and join what kids are doing and join with them, not kind of patronizingly pat their curly heads and say, oh, yeah, I understand. Really try to see what they're seeing, to try to see through their eyes. Because children, it's interesting that Christ said at one stage, you want to get to the kingdom of heaven? You won't even get inside the front door unless you become as little children. So what was he seeing in little children? Firstly, they're extraordinarily posh for asking questions. Kids ask the really important questions. Secondly, they're filled with awe at everything around them. Every single thing fascinates them. Yes. Thirdly, they're born prejudice-free. They have to be taught prejudice. And fourthly, they're extraordinarily forgiving. They'll even forgive the kind of the abusive parents or caregivers, until they learn later not to. And so here are the 4 great attributes. Christ says that's what you need in order to enter the kingdom. Ask the really important questions. Be awestruck at life. Be prejudice-free. See everybody as a child of God. And then fourthly, be able to forgive no matter what happens to you. Realize people are doing what they're doing. They're justifying it in their own way. There's always a reason that people are doing what they're doing. There's a French proverb that says, to understand everything is to forgive everything. It doesn't mean to condone it or excuse it, but it means to understand why precisely they're behaving in the way they're behaving. And when I understand that, I can harvest it, I can learn a lesson from it, and I can grow because of it.
So what is left for you to do that you haven't done?
My biggest fear, Sandie, is falling asleep. That's the only fear I have at this stage. That somehow I'd fall asleep and forget who I am, why I'm here, what my purpose is. That for whatever circumstances, whether it's money or kind of fame or whatever would present itself, that somehow I'd got diverted and started putting energy into trying to create an image or security, rather than continuing to kind of look at the world in which I live and try to understand, okay, I volunteer to be here now. I'm not in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there is nobody here in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so my purpose is to wake myself up to that realization, to help wake others up to that realization, and all of us together to create that level of kind of Christ consciousness on the planet itself. What Chris Bash is talking about, this global shift in consciousness into the realization that when we really see things as they are, there is only love. There is nothing except love. There is nothing except love.
On that note, we're going to finish the show. There's so much more to say, and I'm sure you and I will have many more conversations. Father Sean O'Leary, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list of spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
A big hug to you, Sandie.
You too. I learn so much every time I talk to you.
Thank you, Pat.
So you can learn more about Father Sean O'Leary's workbook, events, blog posts, and homilies at spiritsin spacesuits.com. You can also read the book and also check out his book on, it's completely gone, your latest one, which I love so much.
Setting God Free.
Setting God Free, that's it. Check it out. It's a fascinating book. That's it. That's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll be back at the same time next week with another interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club.